Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing the legal war being waged against Israel, known as lawfare, and how it should be not Israel put on trial, but Israel's enemies. Warm welcome, and my guest today is a good friend of mine, and he's comes all the way from the Netherlands. Andrew Tucker, Director of the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. Andrew, pleasure to have you on the programme. Many of our viewers will recognise you because you're a regular on the European Report, so it's great to have you here in London.
Good to be here, thanks Simon.
And can you tell our viewers, because you're involved in a wonderful new initiative called the Hague Initiative, to really defend Israel in terms of international law. But before we discuss what you're doing now, it'd be great, because it's been a while since you've been on the Middle East Report, if you just share a little bit about your faith and your background, how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, and how the Lord has really raised you up to stand with Israel and the Jewish people.
Okay, so thanks Simon, it is a pleasure to be back with you again. I grew up in Australia, and I grew up in a Christian family, and have always been taught about the importance of the Jewish people. So, and also had a lot of contacts with Jewish people growing up. I came to live in the Netherlands in my late 20s, having lived and worked in the UK for a number of years. My background is international law. I've worked in mainly commercial international law for a number of years in the UK and in the Netherlands. But have always been very interested and involved in this whole project of Israel and the restoration of the Jewish people. For a number of years, I had the privilege of serving with an organisation called Christians for Israel. And now I've moved back full-time into international law because I believe that there is a discussion that needs to take place about the role of international law and the way it affects the state of Israel and the Jewish people. I feel very strongly about that, and I'm pleased to be able to do it. We'll talk a little more about that, but I think as a Christian that it's important to be involved, and to be involved as a professional. From a Christian perspective, I don't think there's anything contradictory in that at all. In fact, I think whether you're Christian or atheist or Muslim, you have something to bring to the table. So as a Christian, I believe it's important for me to be involved in this discussion about international law.
Absolutely. And can you tell us about the Hague Initiative, how your new organisation was set up and the aims and objectives behind it?
Well, we're a new organisation. We've only been in existence for just over 1 year. It grew out of some work that I and others have been doing through the European Coalition for Israel, particularly in Europe, but also now increasingly in other contexts, including the UN in New York and other places. And a growing sense, obviously, of lawfare and the use of international law, or the misuse of international law, even in relation to Israel. Now, there are a number of organisations working in this area from Israel, a number from the United States, but as far as we're aware, there's nothing in Europe which is focusing on these areas, let alone into other areas of the world. So we're very much based in the Netherlands. We're based in The Hague, which is the international legal capital of the world. It's the home of the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and many of the international institutions. The Peace Palace is there, obviously, and which is a kind of a beacon for international law. So we believe it's a very strategic place to be. And our goal is really, in the first instance, to engage with academic lawyers around the world on these topics, and there are many lawyers working in this area. And our role as Think, as we call the Hague Initiative, is to be a platform or a forum for academic lawyers to talk about the relationship between Israel and the rule of law. So it's really about the way law is used, the way international law is used in the international community. And we want to generate and promote that discussion. That's the first thing we're doing. Secondly, we want to reach out to governments to inform them of the work we're doing and the arguments that are being developed. And thirdly, we'd like to play a role towards the general public and the media, so that there's a little more informed understanding about what international law is and how it works. We hear a lot from one particular side about how illegal Israel's activities are. We believe the reality is a little more nuanced, and we'd like to see a more contextual discussion in the media about the way law works to Israel. What is Israel? What is this Jewish state? How does it relate to the Palestinians, Israel's neighbours? And how can international law creatively play a role that's going to promote cooperation and peace between Israel and its neighbours? Instead of separation and conflict, we'd like to see cooperation and partnership, which we believe is the road to peace. And we believe that's actually the heart of the UN Charter, is about friendly relations between nations and states and peoples.
Absolutely, sounds excellent. So I'm a great fan of your work, Andrew. And you've also written this book here. We got it up on screen, called Israel on Trial. So can you? I mean, it's a very comprehensive book. So looking at human rights, UNESCO treaties, and the ICC, for an example. So I mean, you've spent a lot of time and research on this book. Can you share with us why you wrote the book and what you hope to achieve from it?
Well, the first thing we try to do with the book is just to explain to people what is international law and how it works, and how is it working in relation to Israel. So it's written really for, not so much for lawyers as for non-lawyers, although it's a significantly thick book. You have to work your way through it, but we hope it's a kind of a useful tool and a handbook, if you like, to understand how these different areas of law apply to Israel. Secondly, we try to show how this lawfare works in the international institutions, mainly in the UN. So our thesis is really that really for the last 40 to 50 years, international law has been used by certain actors in the UN setting to achieve what is really a political or military goal. That's what lawfare is, and that goal is to undermine the Jewish state of Israel. And we're seeing that today in all of the international institutions. So it's very, very relevant, it's very actual. And the book, we hope, and there are other publications, and we'll be doing many more publications. So we hope it's an introduction to people who understand a little bit more about how this all works.
Excellent. And Andrew, can you explain a little bit more about the term lawfare? I mean, for many of our viewers, this might be the first time they've ever heard of something called lawfare. Yeah. How is international law being used to wage war against Israel? And can you also give us some examples?
Well, lawfare, the idea of the concept of lawfare is the use of law for political or military objectives. So that can happen at the local, national level, or it can happen at the international level. But it happens mainly at the international level. The difficult thing about international law is it is very political by nature. Okay, so in the United Kingdom, laws are made by, it's a common law system, the laws are made by the courts and by the legislature. You have, the House which makes laws, and you have courts which interpret the laws, and you have an executive that administers the laws, and so forth. You don't have that in international law. There's no such thing as a law-making legislature. The UN doesn't make international law. International law is made by states and international actors. So it's changing all the time. And it's very easy for that system to be kind of used for political purposes. So Israel is the main case in which we see lawfare taking place. And it's the use of the international institutions, mainly the UN General Assembly and the Security Council and the Court of Justice, to undermine the Jewish state. And it's a very dedicated policy. Really, since the late 1960s, early 1970s, a number of states have used the UN to develop a lot of resolutions which have been directed against Israel. Israel is the only nation where there's been such a consistent and large number of resolutions focused on one state. So lawfare is about the misuse of law. It's also about the discriminatory use of law, the imbalanced use of law. So there's nothing wrong with saying Israel acts illegally in certain circumstances. Most states are subject to that claim. There's no state that's perfect and applying international law perfect in every sense. What's problematic is the overemphasis on one nation and one particular case in applying international law, and in such a way that it is undermining the state of Israel itself. And I can explain a little bit more about why it is undermining the Jewish state of Israel.
Yes, we discuss that a little bit later on, but I mean, if we talk about Israel as a nation, it's so interesting when you listen to Alan Dershowitz, and we've got a video of his to show shortly, is the fact that he says that Israel was actually formed by lawyers. So therefore, Israel has probably far more legal legitimacy as a nation state than most modern nations that were birthed out of the aftermath of the Second World War. But why is Israel constantly on trial? Why do so many academics and international institutions, for example, still question Israel's very legitimacy as a legal state to exist?
Well, I think it's got to do firstly with the fact that the way the state was created was unique in a sense, okay? So you go back to after the First World War in 1920, the Paris Peace Summit, which was all about creating a settlement after the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Turkish Empire and the German Empire. And a settlement was reached in relation to the Middle East, and mandates were created. So Syria today, Iraq, Jordan owe their existence to those mandates. So does Israel. But the unique thing about Israel, of course, was that the mandate was for the establishment, the re-establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But the Jews were not living in the land at the time. So it allowed the Jews, promoted the right of the Jews to come from the diaspora back to the land. That was the only case in which that applied at that time. There are other nations which have a similar history, like Greece, for example. So I don't think it's right to say Israel was created by the United Nations. It wasn't. Even though it was created in 1948, 3 years after the establishment of the UN, it doesn't owe its existence to the UN as a state. In the same way that Iraq does not owe its existence to the UN. It owes existence to those mandates which were intended to result in statehood. But there is a sense that somehow Israel was created by the partition plan, or it was created by the UN recognition of Israel. Somehow the UN feels it owns Israel. It somehow has to be the one that determines whether it exists, how it exists, where it exists. And that's why you have all these resolutions. But actually, it's the only state that we talk about in those terms. States don't get created by the UN. International law doesn't work that way. There are rules about how states come into existence. And it's the same with Palestine. The UN doesn't have the right or the power to create the state of Palestine. That state will only exist when it satisfies certain criteria. At least this is one approach to international law. So we have seen the UN system being formed and being developed in a way that somehow UN resolutions have taken on a status whereby people see them as having power to decide on whether states exist and the borders of states. And we believe, and many lawyers would agree with us, that that's not the role of the UN.
Let's have a look now at this excellent video produced by Prager University, and this is Alan Dershowitz talking about the legal foundations of the modern State of Israel.
Of all the countries that have come into existence in the last century, no country's birth certificate is more legitimate than that of Israel. One reason is that many of the men who founded the country, Theodore Herzl, Zeb Jabotinsky, David Ben-Gurion, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, were either lawyers or had legal training. They were obsessed with making it legal. Unlike almost every other country, lawyers, not generals, were the midwives of Israel's birth, or more accurately, rebirth, since it had existed as an independent country twice before in history. Step by legal step, Israel moved legally toward nationhood, from the Balfour Declaration in 1917 to the San Remo Agreement in 1920, to the League of Nations Resolution in 1922, to the Anglo-American Convention on Palestine in 1924, to the partition of land ordained by the United Nations in 1947 into a nation-state for the Jewish people and an Arab state. Yet immediately upon its lawful establishment in 1948 as the nation-state of the Jewish people, Israel was illegally attacked by all the surrounding Arab states, as well as by elements of the local Arab population. In defending its right to exist during that war, Israel lost 1% of its population, including many civilians and Holocaust survivors. It also lost some of the land assigned to it by the United Nations. It captured other land from the aggressors that was originally assigned to the Arab state. The end result of that war against Israel was an armistice line that prevailed until 1967, when Israel was once again attacked by Jordan during Israel's war with Egypt and Syria. Between 1948 and 1967, despite the armistice, Arab terrorists continued to infiltrate Israeli borders and to injure and kill Israeli citizens. That was part of an official policy by the surrounding governments and by leaders of local Palestinian groups. All of it was in violation, obvious violation of international law. Following the establishment of Israel, a transfer of populations occurred. Several 100,000 Arabs who fled from Israel during the War of Independence were not allowed to return. Some had chosen to leave, assured by their Arab leaders that the fledgling country would not last a week. Others were forced to leave. At that time, approximately the same number of Jews were forced to leave Arab countries, another violation of international law, where they had lived for thousands of years. The difference was that Arab countries kept the Arabs who left Israel in refugee camps, where many of them still live more than half a century after leaving Israel. And Israel, on the other hand, fully integrated all the Jewish refugees from Arab countries into Israeli society, where many of their descendants now serve in the highest positions of Israeli life. Israel's establishment as the nation-state of the Jewish people by entirely lawful means is quite remarkable for several reasons. First, there is no country in the world that is as surrounded by hostile enemies as is Israel. It's been that way since 1948. Yet Israel sought the way of the pen rather than of the sword. It has needed the sword to survive, but its preference has always been for the pen. That is, for peaceful negotiations. Its peace treaty with Egypt in 1978, its peaceful abandonment of Gaza in 2005, and its many attempts to reach a peace agreement with the Palestinians are examples. Yet despite its entirely lawful origins, Israel is the only country in the world today whose origins, and therefore its very legitimacy, have been questioned by the General Assembly of the United Nations, by numerous member nations, and by many organizations that claim the mantle of human rights and the rule of law. Ironically, current attacks on Israel's legitimacy have taken the form of lawfare, the use of international law as a weapon. Any fair tribunal that judged Israel by universal standards would reject such attacks out of hand. But alas, international courts, like the UN itself, have been packed by those bitterly antagonistic to the nation-state of the Jewish people. For example, the misnamed International Court of Justice refuses to acknowledge that Israel, a country that deals with terror attacks and the threats of terror attacks on a regular basis, has any special security needs. As I've demonstrated, this phenomenon, questioning the very right of Israel to exist as the nation-state of the Jewish people, cannot be explained on legal grounds or on any other rational basis for that matter. So then, how can this worldwide attack on Israel alone be explained? In only one way. It is pure bigotry. And there's a word for this bigotry: anti-Semitism. if you have a better explanation for why the one country in the world whose right to exist is denied is also the one country that is the nation state of the Jewish people, I ask you, what is it? I'm Alan Dershowitz, professor of law at Harvard University for Prager University.
And Alan Dershowitz explains very well to us what is lawfare against Israel. Andrew, just coming on to, I mean, we often hear in our media, don't we, that Israel is illegally occupying Jerusalem. They talk about how that Jewish settlements are illegal under international law, and also saying that the security fence that protects Israel from 100% of suicide bombings and terrorist attacks is an illegal barrier. So can you break down some of these issues? So if we start off firstly with the claim that Jewish settlements are illegal under international law, are they? And what international law is Israel breaking by extending farms, homes and communities in the biblical heartland of Israel, known as Judea and Samaria?
Well, there's what we would call a legal paradigm which applies today. And I think most people, probably the great majority of people subscribe to this idea. And we see it in these resolutions time and again. We've seen it in the Court of Justice. And Alan Dershowitz referred to it indirectly in talking about the Court of Justice refusal to accept that Israel has legitimate security needs and the right to self-defense against Palestinian terror. But this paradigm basically says that the territories that Israel captured in 1967 belong to the Palestinians. A Palestinian state should be created on that territory. And those armistice lines of 1949 should be the de facto borders between Israel and this state of Palestine. And all the Israeli settlements in those territories are an obstacle to the creation of that Palestinian state. That's really what's being said. Now, there are different aspects of international law. One of they're using is the Fourth Geneva Convention. And I'd just like to respond to one thing that Dershowitz said, and that is that this idea that somehow the UN allotted territory to Israel in 1947 through the UN partition plan. I don't believe it did. The UN partition plan never came into effect. It was a proposal by the General Assembly for the creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state with an economic union. And Jerusalem would have some kind of international status. Corpus separatum was called. That plan never was effectuated. Why not? Because it was rejected by the Arabs. So I don't think it's right to say that the UN allotted territory to Israel or to anybody else, because it didn't have the power to do it, and it didn't do it, didn't even try to do it. The next thing that happened was the State of Israel was created 6 months later in May 1948. And to this day, nobody has ever been clear about what the borders are, the eastern borders of the State of Israel. Are they those armistice lines with Jordan, which is now known as the Green Line or the 67 lines, or is it the Jordan River? Or is it even further? And I think that issue is still on the table. This paradigm, however, that we're seeing in the UN institutions says, no, the borders are those borders which are now known as the 1967 lines, they're commonly called. But in reality, they are the armistice lines between Israel and the state of Jordan, which, as Dershowitz said rightly, had illegally attacked Israel in 1948, the day after it was created. Now, to come back to the Fourth Geneva Convention, what the argument is that somehow, first of all, they say Israel is occupying that territory. Okay? The law of occupation says where there's a conflict between two states, and one state takes control of territory to which the other has a claim, then the occupying power has the obligation to administer that territory in accordance with certain rules. It's all about protecting the local population. So there's nothing illegal about occupation. Now, probably 99% of the international legal community believes that Israel is an occupying power. There are a minority who disagree. We take that view as well in our book. We put the arguments, but it's not a majority view, unfortunately. So the presumption is Israel is an occupying power. Now, occupiers are not allowed to do certain things. One thing they're not allowed to do is to move their population from their own country into the occupied territories. Why not? Because that's what Russia did and Germany did during and after the Second World War. They massively moved their populations to ethnically cleanse those territories and make them German or Russian.
Yeah.
People think that's what Israel's doing in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and what, as you said, is rightly called Judea and Samaria. The reality is most people, although the government has enabled them to do it, have gone to live there for very different reasons. It's an economically sensible thing to do. It's actually cheaper to live in some of these communities. Many are motivated biblically. They want to live in their heartland of their nation. Others are doing it for other reasons. Some of them are military outposts. They're there for security reasons. So to call all settlements illegal, I think, is a misuse of Article 49.6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, because Israel has not been moving its people into the territories to ethnically cleanse it of Palestinians. The West Bank, as we know, is big enough for the Jews and the Arabs to live there together. So there's a problem in calling all settlements illegal, because that's not what the Fourth Geneva Convention does. There may be in individual cases if Israel is an occupying power. But that's all about the Fourth Geneva Convention. A completely different question is territorial sovereignty. Now, Israel claims it still has a claim to the old city of Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, a legitimate claim to territorial sovereignty. And that derives from its history, leading, as Professor Dershowitz says, from the Balfour Declaration through San Remo to the League of Nations up to the creation of the State of Israel. Israel claims it has a legitimate right to territorial sovereignty over all of Jerusalem and all or part of the West Bank.
Andrew, I just want to pick up something you said, because it's important to talk about this, and particularly the definition of occupation. I mean, Israel was involved in a defensive war in 1967, was attacked by 3 Arab armies, the Egyptians, the Jordanians and the Syrians. And there was such a huge build-up of forces in the Sinai poised to attack Israel, that Israel had no other choice but to take a preemptive strike against the Egyptians in early June 1967. After the Six-Day War, you had the Jordanians and the Israelis working together to provide education, healthcare, roads and infrastructure for the, say, the Palestinians, who were only called the Palestinians really since the 1970s. And then we see that in 1988, after the first Intifada of 1987, it was the King Hassan of Jordan who decided to relinquish any claim to Judea and Samaria, or known as the international community term it, the West Bank. So therefore, if the Jordanians controlled it before 67, then the Israelis did, and now because of the legal foundations of the Oslo Accords have allowed the Palestinian Authority self-rule and self-government. How can Israel be an occupying power when there are no Israeli flags in Bethlehem or in areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority? The Palestinians have its own police force, its own government and everything else. So how can the international community say that this is an occupation when Israel is definitely not an occupying these towns and cities?
I mean, I agree with you. There's a strange thing happening that on the one hand, the Palestinians and the Arab world say Palestine is a state, and a state definition of a state is an entity that has an effective government that controls a territory. So they say we, the Palestinians, control the West Bank, therefore we are a state. On the other hand, they say, well, hang on, Israel is occupying the territories and is exercising its power over the territories, and that's illegal. So in a way, they want to have it both ways. The complicating factor is the Oslo agreements. I mean, Israel, for better or for worse, entered into a bona fide, good faith negotiations with the Palestinians. I must say, with the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was created in 1964, so before the 67 Six-Day War, by the Arab League. And then we saw after the Six-Day War, and then especially after the Yom Kippur War in 73, a kind of renaissance of the PLO, which suddenly became this legitimate political entity representing the Palestinian people. And when Jordan took its hand off the West Bank, as it did in the course of the 70s and 80s, the PLO suddenly became this entity that the Arab world wanted to support as having Arab control over the West Bank. In order to respect the Palestinian desire for autonomy, Israel entered into the Oslo agreements. And as you said, rightly, the result has been a dividing up of the West Bank to areas where now the PLO, through the Palestinian Authority, has complete control over a number of cities and parts of the West Bank. So it's kind of a non sequitur to say that the Palestinians have no control over the West Bank, because they do. And therefore Israel can't be an occupying force in those areas because it doesn't exercise control over those areas. So it's a very complex, messy set of issues. And I think what we're trying to do is trying to unwrap the box, okay, and say, look, there's different elements involved here. There's human rights law, there's international humanitarian law, particularly the law of occupation. There's the law relating to territorial sovereignty and sovereignty generally. And there's the law around statehood and what constitutes states and so forth. And there's law relating to the creation of the state or not of Palestine. And all these things need to be seen in their totality. And I think the sort of one-liner, bland statements that the settlements are illegal is not helping, because we're not getting to the core of the complexity of the issues. And we'd like to see more of a discussion in the academic world, but also in the political world and media, about what those issues are. And I believe Alan Dershowitz said it rightly, Israel is doing the very best it can. It's not perfect, but to try and comply with the rule of law and international law. But there are limits. And it says, I believe rightly, we have also a legitimate claim to the old city of Jerusalem. You don't have a right, UN or Europe, to tell us whether we have a right to be in the old city of Jerusalem or Judea and Samaria. We'll work that out ourselves with our neighbours, just like every other nation in the world works it out, by negotiation or by war, whatever it takes. So there's a dispute going on about the extent to which the international institutions have a right to determine where the borders and the scope of the nature of the State of Israel are. And I think that's the core of the issue.
And why is it the international community single out Israel to say that this is where your borders should be? I mean, the international community, the UN Security Council, saying that Israel's borders are based on UN Resolution 181 and should go back to those armistice lines, because there weren't even borders after Israel's War of Independence in 1948. And then we see a UN resolution called 242 that was actually formed by the British government after the Six-Day War, which talked about land for peace, but Israel had the right to live in secure borders. So therefore, and then we see kind of other UN later resolutions like UN Resolution 2334 that does not recognise Israeli sovereignty over their eternal capital, Jerusalem, and saying how this is an Islamic capital, this capital belongs to the Arab world, and yet completely ignores history. And surely this is, and Israel's been singled out like no other nation Is it like Alan Dershowitz says, because of anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel that's driving the international community to adopt such a ridiculous and dangerous, I would say, position regarding Israel and the Palestinian Authority?
You have to look at it at different levels, I think. I mean, I don't take the position that everybody who criticises Israel, even people who have a view about the status of East Jerusalem, the territories, they're not doing it necessarily out of a hatred or bigotry towards Israel. I think many are genuinely trying to see how international law applies. Look, you know, for 2,000 years, the international community has been absorbed and obsessed with Palestine and Jerusalem. We fought over it for 2,000 years. The Crimea Wars, almost 200 years ago, it was about Jerusalem. So nations for millennia have always kind of thought that they own Jerusalem. That's not new. I think we're just seeing it again in a different kind of guise. One issue which I think has made it problematic is the rise of the Islam in the Middle East and the Arab world. We've seen, certainly since the 1940s, has increased the intensity of its claim upon East Jerusalem, in fact all of Jerusalem and the West Bank. It's part of the constitution of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It's part of all the Arab League documentation is the right of the Arab people to control Palestine. Europe, I think there are a lot of aspects there, but one is I think the Christian world, which has tended to say that, you know, the Old Testament, the Jewish people have no place anymore in our worldview. The church has replaced Israel, and therefore the Jewish people have no claim anymore to territory or land. That's an old idea. We don't like it anymore. We're about universalism. We're about, you know, the idea of a peaceful, all nations having a place in it. I think that kind of thinking has played a role in European mentality. And then there's the relationship between Europe and the Arab world. After 1973 and the Arab oil boycott and Palestinian territory, terrorism, there was an accord reached between Europe and the Arab world. And the price that was paid was Jerusalem and the West Bank. Europe committed itself in 1973 to the creation of, effectively, of a Palestinian state. And that's European policy to this very day. And it's very deeply ingrained in the European psyche. And we can have an argument about international law, but I think the motivation goes much deeper. To call it anti-Semitism, I'm not sure we should accuse everybody who takes a view of anti-Semitism. Yeah. There is, however, an obsession, an absurd obsession with Israel and the Jewish people. And of course the UN has every right to make resolutions about this, but to claim that it has the power to decide where the Jewish people may live, I think is going a bridge too far.
Well, that is anti-Semitism, because it's singling out one single nation just because it's the one and only Jewish nation. So therefore, by that definition, it's actually anti-Semitism or Jew hatred. And particularly when we see the Arab nations gathered together with the old Soviet nations, even now with Russia, and we see these constant condemning of Israel in the United Nations, and the United Nations spends more time condemning Israel than any other state. And this is why, you know, that we have such a remarkable woman in Nikki Haley, America's ambassador to the UN, standing up from Israel, pulling the United States out of UNESCO, which Israel's done as well. Yeah. Stop the funding for the UN Human Rights Council, which is a complete joke, particularly when you have like the nations like Iran and Libya, even Iraq and Syria have at one time been head of these human rights commissions, looking into human rights abuses around the world and using that position to attack Israel when they have the worst human rights record. So surely by this constant attacking of Israel by the international community and singling out Israel as the only Jewish state, isn't this actually undermining the whole international legal system and UN resolutions?
I think so. I mean, I agree with you. I think what's happening is an abuse of law, abuse of the rule of law, and it's setting a very bad precedent. I also think it's creating perverse incentives for the players on the ground. If the Palestinians and the Arabs think that the UN's going to serve them up on a platter, this state, without having to work to create the institutions which make that state a reality,
yes,
then I think we're giving them the idea that it doesn't matter what they do, they're going to get this state presented to them. And not only that, but it'll be a state which is based upon a kind of antagonism, that's putting it mildly, a hatred towards Israel and the Jewish people. And I think we ought to be putting a kind of red line and saying, well, look, you want a state, you want autonomy, that's fine. You want self-determination, that's fine. And that was the idea of Oslo, is let's work through the issues together and find a balance between your interests and rights and our interests and rights.
Absolutely, yes.
And we are a state, Israel is saying quite rightly, because it is a state. It came from a certain background, and I think nobody can justifiably question its existence as a state. Therefore, it has a certain bundle of rights and obligations, but also rights, including a right to secure borders, territorial inviolability, and political independence. That is what states have. So we shouldn't be creating something for the Palestinians which is infringing on those basic rights. And I believe we need a new kind of process, and we need a new kind of paradigm which is going to look at those issues. And that's our objective as Think, is to gather bright minds, bright international lawyers, and to look at those very issues.
Absolutely. And I think you raised up a very good point, Andrew, and that is, what is the nature of a future Palestinian state? One that is constantly antagonising Israel, doesn't recognise Israel as a Jewish state. On the PLO Covenant Charter, but also on the Hamas Charter, they call for the destruction of the State of Israel. So therefore, if the UN and Israel was to listen to the International Security Council and actually gave the Palestinians their own state, pulled out of all the checkpoints and gave up control of the Jordan Valley and allowed the creation of a Palestinian state, we know that if there were democratic elections, Hamas would win. So Israel would be negotiating with Fatah and the PLO today, but tomorrow Hamas would be in charge. That would then cause the destabilisation of Jordan, because Jordan is 70% Palestinian, and then you create, next to Israel's borders, a terrorist entity that is not committed to the rule of law, that's not committed to peaceful relations, but wanting to use that as a springboard in order to annihilate the State of Israel. Why don't the international community particularly look at the aspects of these policies and the impact that they will have on the region, not only Israel, but also the more moderate Arab states in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, I agree with you. These are the issues we should be looking at. And there are people looking at them, but I think the interests in the creation of the Palestinian state are so large. Interestingly, though, you do have this new scenario developing with Israel, I think, in Egypt and Saudi Arabia in particular, a new kind of alliance that's developing. And I hope that will also put a kind of a brake on this roller coaster train that is creating. Now, we're not against the Palestinians. I think the Palestinians themselves deserve better.
Oh, absolutely.
What they deserve is a government that's looking after their interests. And the last thing they need is a kind of extreme jihad Islamic regime which is not going to recognise their human rights, nor their right to economic development and well-being. And nor is it going to help peace between Palestine and Israel. So I fully agree we need to be re-looking at all of those issues.
Let's have a look at this video now that discusses how Israel is fighting back against lawfare, and particularly against terrorism, against Israelis, and actually using the court and the power of law to bring those terrorists to justice.
are in a Hebrew University in Jerusalem. In July 2002, a terrorist from the Hamas organization entered the cafeteria, left a bag full of explosive right in the middle of the cafeteria, left the cafeteria, activated the bomb, and the bag blew up. 9 people got killed, more than 80 people got injured.
זה מה שנותר מן הקפיטריה בלב הקמפוס של האוניברסיטה העברית בהר הצופים בירושלים.
We are representing some of the families of the kids that got killed in this attack. A terror organization is like a business. They cannot function without the money. In order to send the suicide bomber to the middle of Jerusalem, they need to keep him on payroll every single month until they send him. In order to support the families of the suicide bombers, they need to pay the money, and they do.
أنا أطالب بالأسرى لأن هؤلاء بشر وهؤلاء قاموا بعمل نحن أمرناهم به نحن كسلطة.
When the Intifada broke out in the year of 2000 and the blood was spilled on the streets, we decided that there is a way to fight back, there is a way to bring these terror organizations to court and to impose a measure of justice on the terror victims. So we established Shurat Adin, Israel Law Center, to take all these hundreds of cases and file them in orderly manner in the courts around the world. Today we are holding judgments for over $1 billion. We put a lien on $600 million in terror assets, and we actually collected, we got into our hands over $120 million that we gave to the terror victims.
December the 1st, 2001, Saturday night, Adam was 14 and a half years old, and they are going to a coffee shop to have some ice cream and to come back. And we informed a little later by my second boy that it was a terror attack in Jerusalem. A family that lose a child, it's not the same family. The only thing that's important to me in that case is that someone will pay for what they've done, and someone will not do it again.
No money can bring back life. No money can attach a leg back to the body. But there is something with giving these terror victims some sort of compensation. Our purpose is to teach the terror organizations and whoever supports them that if they take part in a terror attack, they will have to pay, that there is a cost for this blood. As a result of our cases, the terror organization cannot use the banking system anymore, and they cannot bring the hundreds of millions of dollars they used to bring. That prevents them from using money to carry out more and more terror attacks, something they could have done if they had the same amount of money. If you stop the flow of the money, you stop the flow of the terrorism. And this is our goal, this is our purpose, to bankrupt terrorism one lawsuit at a time.
Doing such important work there because I had a friend of mine called Janice Coulter, who was actually murdered in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the cafeteria. She was an American, and she was in charge of bringing a group of American Jews to study in Israel with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And on the day that that group arrived, she was actually in the canteen when Palestinian terrorists planted a bomb in the cafeteria that killed her and many others. So it's important that we fight terrorism. And for me, this is very much personal because I knew her and many like her when I was in Israel for the first time in 1996 with a program to do with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So to actually know someone personally that's been murdered in a Palestinian terror attack, it becomes real. And that's why it's so important, for example, that there are organisations like the one we just saw that want to hold the Palestinian Authority to account, bring them to justice, so that they actually face the crimes of promoting and supporting terrorism that has resulted in the loss of innocent lives.
Simon, I think there is a really deep problem here, and this is the use of terror and violence. You know, as an international community, we have somehow given the Palestinians, we accept that they have a right to use violence. They call it violence to liberate themselves from the occupation, okay? I don't see how we as an international community, how international law can be used, can be allowed to be used to support the use of violence against, even if the Palestinians have a right to self-determination. We cannot allow a state to be created and at the same time allowing the PLO and the PA to be promoting terror. The PLO, the Palestinian National Charter to this day has never been amended as Arafat promised in 1993. And to this day it allows and promotes the use of jihadic violence against Israel to liberate the Palestinians from the occupation. And I think it's deeply problematic to allow that to happen at the same time to be promoting Palestinian statehood, in which the PLO still is recognised as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. We need to break out of that paradigm and find a new approach.
Andrew Tucker, thank you so much for being my excellent guest on today's Middle East Report.
Thank you very much.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's programme. We see how international law is so complicated, and that's why it's important that we understand the truth for ourselves and defend the one and only Jewish state, that is Israel.